Welcome back to the Grep News Podcast. I'm Bam Rather, and our show today is about the Pentagon's battle with major news organizations over who gets to ask questions in the halls of military power. Let me walk you through what's happening at the Pentagon right now, because what we're seeing isn't just a policy dispute. It's a test case for whether government institutions can legally formalize a preference for friendly coverage over independent reporting. The building where America's military leadership operates, where decisions about war and peace get made. That building has essentially been emptied of independent journalists. And the New York Times just filed a lawsuit about it. Here's the paper trail. Last fall, Pete Hegseth's Pentagon presented reporters with a 21-page rulebook. Not guidance, a rulebook. And buried in those pages was language that gave Pentagon officials what the lawsuit calls unbridled discretion to revoke press credentials. Not just for publishing classified information, which has always been legally complicated, but for soliciting disclosure of information. Any information, even unclassified information, even information gathered entirely off Pentagon grounds. The policy states, and I'm quoting the bureaucratic language here, soliciting disclosure of sensitive information may be considered when determining if a reporter poses a security risk. Now, translate that. What it means is, if a Pentagon official doesn't like the questions you're asking, you're out. So reporters from The Times, The Washington Post, The Associated Press, CBS, CNN, NPR, and, this matters, Fox News staged a walkout. They surrendered their credentials rather than sign this agreement. Because what they were being asked to sign wasn't a security protocol. It was prior restraint on journalism itself. And here's what happened next. Those offices didn't stay empty. They got reassigned. The Pentagon press corps now includes Laura Loomer, Gateway Pundit, Lindell TV, as in Mike Lindell, the MyPillow guy's streaming network. These aren't news organizations in any traditional sense. They're content creators broadly sympathetic to the administration. The Pentagon press secretary, Kingsley Wilson, said this explicitly. Legacy media chose to self-deport from this building. The American people don't trust these propagandists because they stopped telling the truth. So we're not going to beg these old gatekeepers to come back. Now, there's something genuinely interesting about that statement, because it's being used as evidence in the lawsuit. The Times argues that calling established news organizations propagandists while replacing them with pro-administration outlets is potent evidence of viewpoint discrimination, which violates the First Amendment. The legal theory here draws on two precedents, Sherrill versus Knight from the Nixon era and Karam versus Trump. Both establish that the government can't use press credentials as a weapon against coverage it doesn't like. The credentials are access to a public forum, Pentagon briefings, official announcements, the ability to ask questions on the record. You can't condition that access on editorial compliance. But here's where this gets complicated. The Pentagon is arguing they're imposing common sense rules that protect military personnel, and they're pointing to a real statistic. National trust in mainstream media has dropped to 28%. So the question isn't whether people trust the New York Times. The real question is whether low public trust in media gives the government authority to decide which journalists get access based on whether officials approve of their coverage. And that's when I realized something. This isn't a story about one administration, or even about Hegseth specifically. This is a story about what happens when you try to formalize audience capture at the institutional level. Because think about what the Pentagon did. They looked at declining trust in mainstream media and said, okay, we're going to restructure access to reward outlets our audience likes and punish outlets our audience distrusts. They're trying to turn the Defense Department's relationship with the press into a content strategy. More after our break.
My name is Tom Sachs. I'm an artist in New York City. For nearly 2 decades, I have been collaborating with Nike.
Nike running is for runners. Nike basketball is for basketball. Nike craft is for everyone else.
But here's what makes that fascinating from an investigative standpoint. The journalists who got kicked out, they didn't stop reporting, they just started reporting from outside the building. And they've been breaking stories that directly contradict Pentagon talking points. They broke the story about U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear sites that the Pentagon hadn't disclosed. They reported on strikes against Venezuelan vessels that contradicted official accounts, including what sources called a double tap strike, where a boat was hit once, then targeted again after survivors were spotted. Experts told those reporters that pattern may constitute a war crime under international law. They reported that an inspector general found Hegseth's private signal chats about Yemen airstrikes could have endangered American troops. In other words, the Pentagon tried to control the information environment by controlling physical access, and it didn't work. The stories got out anyway. Which raises a question about what this policy was ever supposed to accomplish. If the goal was security, you'd expect the policy to target specific behaviors, publishing classified information, revealing operational details that endanger troops. But that's not what the rulebook does. It gives officials discretion to remove journalists for asking questions about sensitive information, which isn't defined. It allows them to consider a reporter's entire body of work, including stories that never involved classified material. That's not a security protocol, that's an editorial veto. And here's the thing about editorial vetoes from government officials. They have a tell. You can see what they're really worried about by looking at what they're calling sensitive. The lawsuit names Julian Barnes as a plaintiff. He's a national security reporter who has covered military and intelligence issues across multiple administrations. His recent work includes reporting on Hegseth's confirmation fight, which was contentious because Hegseth faced questions about past behavior and qualifications. Several major outlets issued a joint statement opposing these rules: ABC News, CBS News, CNN, Fox News Media, NBC News. The Pentagon Press Association, which represents journalists across the political spectrum, called the policy antithetical to a free and independent press and prohibited by the First Amendment. This wasn't just legacy media outlets objecting. Many conservative outlets also opposed the policy. This is broader than partisan politics suggests. The precedent the Times is citing is strong. In Sherrill versus Knight, the D.C. Circuit ruled that press credentials can't be denied based on arbitrary or less than compelling reasons, because that turns access into a privilege the government can grant or withhold for political purposes. But here's what makes this case different. According to Gabe Rotman from the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, this isn't about one reporter losing one credential over one incident. This is a policy that binds the entire press corps and gives officials unchecked power over who gets access based on their reporting. The Times lawsuit argues the policy is neither reasonable nor viewpoint neutral. Those are the legal tests from the precedent cases. And the evidence of viewpoint discrimination is pretty stark. Mainstream outlets called propagandists, replaced by pro-administration content creators, with a press secretary saying explicitly they're not interested in having critical outlets return. Meanwhile, several news outlets were denied access to a recent briefing entirely, the AP, Washington Post, CNN among them, which means there are Pentagon briefings happening right now where the only reporters in the room are ones whose editorial stance officials approve of. And if you're wondering whether this matters to you personally, here's how to think about it. The Pentagon budget this cycle is about $850 billion. That's your money. More after our break.
Building a new product? Temez Labs takes you from napkin sketch to the App Store. Trusted by Fortune 500s for quality, security, and speed. Book your free strategy session at temez.ai.
The decisions being made in that building affect whether the United States goes to war, how it conducts military operations, what it tells you about why service members die. The policy Hegseth enacted means the journalists most likely to ask hard questions about those decisions, the ones with institutional memory, with sources across administrations, with the legal and financial backing to push back against official narratives, those journalists aren't in the room anymore. What's in the room instead are outlets that Pentagon officials believe will tell their story the way they want it told, which isn't journalism, it's public relations. You have to explain the double-tap strike story. You have to explain the Iran nuclear site reporting. You have to explain the signal chat investigation. Those stories didn't come from the credentialed press corps. They came from reporters working outside the Pentagon who still had sources, still had documentation, still had the institutional knowledge to know what questions to ask, which suggests the policy isn't controlling the information environment. It's just making it harder for the public to know what questions officials are refusing to answer. And that's the through line here. This isn't about one lawsuit or one policy or one administration. It's about whether government institutions can formalize a preference for friendly coverage over independent reporting. The answer, legally, should be no. The First Amendment doesn't give journalists special rights. It protects everyone's right to speak and seek information. But it does prohibit the government from punishing speech it doesn't like. And conditioning press access on approval of coverage is punishment. The architecture of a free press isn't complicated. You need journalists with access, protection from retaliation, and institutional support to report without fear. This Pentagon policy undermines all three. Democracy doesn't depend on people trusting the New York Times, but it does depend on government officials not getting to choose which journalists are trustworthy based on whether they like the coverage. That's what's being litigated. Not trust, control. Thank you for listening to GREP News. If you are enjoying our podcast, please follow the show. Give us a 5-star rating to help us grow, and learn more at grep.news. Until next time.
GREP News. Thomas.